Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final day at the 16th Eurasian Media Forum here in the beautiful city of Almaty, which has shown us very kindly 4 seasons in 2 days. Although those of you who came to the reception last night would have seen the beautiful mountain views and blue skies that we had up there. Well, it was certainly an interesting day of discussions yesterday as the first session took us through the changing power structures across the world as a possible deglobalization sets in. Then the crisis of consumption at unsustainable levels was the focus of the second session, exploring ways to change the pattern of how we use the world's resources. The digital reality of mass media raised a number of thought-provoking comments in the third session, particularly apt for the members of the media that are here at the forum. And then we closed on the ever-fascinating topic of artificial intelligence and how that might shape the not-too-distant future for humanity. We'll continue our excellent debates and discussions today with your questions and comments. But first, a little housekeeping. Those of you who have forgotten, please switch your mobiles to silent. When the sessions are running, please be respectful of what's going on and just be very discreet in your exit and entry. Wear your forum ID badges everywhere, please. Our security is quite high, as you can see. And also, respectfully to all our session moderators, we're going to try to keep to time, so please observe that too. One quick reminder for the panelists going on stage. The microphone buttons are on the boxes by the microphones. You have to switch those on to speak and then switch them off afterwards, please, as they cut each other out. So you may have noticed yesterday people trying to be heard. So I just thought I'd remind you. Our lineup of topics today covers everything from the shifting global power balance and how it affects perhaps the trust we have in our politicians, and we have a very high-powered and interesting panel for that. We go on to how bloggers are now wielding more influence than ever, possibly becoming the rock stars of the media world. And the 7th and final session of the Eurasian Media Forum is going to really stir it up as we look at marijuana and the growing availability of it. So please make sure you attend all 3 of those. They're going to be interesting. Now, we go on to our first session of the day. We certainly have an interesting time in which we live. The last quarter of a century has seen significant shifts in the balance of power globally with the rise of the East and the economic pressures on the West. Where are things heading, and is there a changing relationship between those who govern and their constituents? And our session is entitled Crisis of Trust, Global Power Balance. We promised to make this an interesting session. I'm very honored to invite up my friend and fellow journalist from the heady days at CNN International and Al Jazeera English, now host and executive producer of The Agenda at CGTN. Please welcome Stephen Cole.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Superpower Game of Thrones, live from Almaty, where we're asking who's going to inherit the Iron Throne, if indeed there is one to inherit. What is the global balance of powers in 2019, and who do we trust? People, politicians, institutions, and do we still have confidence in them? East versus West was a very easy configuration to understand. The confrontation and the old world order provided, I think, a sort of stability of sorts. But today is the legacy of consensus builders being replaced by populist risk takers. Has the US given up on nation building? And where are today's global military and possibly economic flashpoints? And what about the US versus China trade war? Could that turn nasty? Is that a new Asian Cold War? And if so, who would mediate? Is there a crisis of international law and international crisis solving? What is the role of the media in all of this? Does it need to re-establish its credentials, its bona fides? Has it lost public trust in a sort of sea of nonsense on social media? Are we getting what Carl Bernstein called the best obtainable version of the truth? Now, there's very few people in here who'll know Harry Seacombe, Mr. Galloway possibly one of them, and his famous song, If I Ruled the World. Well, let's find out who we think our panelists rule the world. Lots of questions. We have 7 panelists who are more than capable of providing very good and interesting and insightful answers. So I'm going to call them up one by one, and starting with Benita Ferreira-Waldner. Would you like to come up, Benita? Benita is president of Euro-America Foundation. She's a diplomat and politician, and EU Commissioner for External Relations and European Neighbourhood Policy. George Galloway, would you come up? George Galloway is a British broadcaster who must be treated with caution, as he recently admitted to my former colleague Andrew Neil on the BBC that he always carries a couple of verbal time bombs, hand grenades in his pocket, if he doesn't like the questioning. I thought he was just pleased to see me. Dr. Jeremias Kettner. Dr. Kettner is from Germany, a global analyst and expert on cultural diplomacy. Mark Siegel. Once Deputy Assistant to the President Carter, now Professor for the Center of Global Affairs at NYU. Mikhail Guzman. A journalist and first Deputy Director General of TASS Russia. He's been with TASS, I think, for 25 years. Next is Anna Hakabian, First Lady of Armenia and Editor-in-Chief of the Armenian Times. And Steve Bannon. Would you join us, Steve? Steve was CEO of President Trump's successful presidential campaign. He's a political strategist, and he's been spending the last few months, if I'm right, Steve, in meeting a series of political leaders across Europe. And so he'll be very interesting to hear about what is happening in Europe, especially as we're in the middle of the European elections. I wonder how far along the road we are on this Game of Thrones. So let's talk first, and I'll ask Steve to answer first, about the country still regarded by many as the world's only superpower, the United States. So, Steve, does Mr. Trump have a strategic game plan to make sure the US stays a superpower?
Well, look, I don't speak for President Trump. I'm not in the administration right now, but I think it's a pretty clear plan about how to. We've had this what is called the post-war liberal rules-based order that's gone on since World War II. That's essentially, if you look from Northwest Europe to around the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea up to the Northwest Pacific, it's a series of commercial relationships, capital markets, trade arrangements, and an American security guarantee. And I think the basic belief of the American people is that we're not an imperial power. We're a revolutionary power. And we've got into a system by our political elites, our permanent political class, both Wall Street, the corporatist, and the political class down in Washington. We tried to virtually, I think, become an imperial power. And that's the big change of Donald Trump. The deplorables, the working class people in the United States, were not happy with the managed decline our elites were putting the United States through. That's why Donald Trump's president. And I think if you look throughout the world, particularly in this engagement in this economic war with China that they've been running on us for the entire industrial West for 20 years, you're starting to see the reinforcement or kind of a restructuring of this rules-based order around individual nation states in the Westphalian system. And I think this weekend in Europe, by Sunday night, early Monday morning, when the populist nationalist sovereignty movement really starts to take charge, you'll start to see, I think, the very beginning stages from Brexit to Trump's victory to now the beginning of a restructuring for the benefit of working class people and middle class people throughout the world.
Thank you, Steve. Just to let you know, I've started with the United States, and just for the panel to know, but I will move on eventually to China. I'll be talking about Russia, I'll be talking about European Union and, as Steve mentioned, of course, nationalism and about Iran. So all those subjects will be covered. So when I ask you directly, you can talk about those subjects directly. And of course, overriding all of those questions and all of those issues and topics is trust. That's at the core of what we're trying to establish today about who we trust and what we trust. But Mark Siegel, I want to come to you next because President Macron accuses President Trump of, quote, dismantling our precious liberal rule-based international order. Mark Siegel, are liberals almost everywhere else saying the same thing, and do they have something to worry about? You've got to switch it on. Lovely, well done.
I think it's hard to talk about liberals all over the world. They're U.S. liberals and social democrats in Europe are not exactly the same. But I think that there is a crisis in the way traditional parties and traditional governments view some of the issues that the Euro populists have raised. And I think all too often these are dismissed. And that's problematic politically and I think also morally. There are reasons that people are concerned about immigration. I don't think reasons like discrimination, anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, anti-black are significant reasons, but there are economic reasons that should be addressed and often are dismissed. And I think I don't know what's going to happen in the EU elections, but if these ethno-populists have success, I think it's more to sort of break down than to build up. I have no idea what their ideology is, nor, by the way, do I have any idea what Donald Trump's foreign policy is. I was asked to teach a course at NYU in the Trump doctrine, and I said I can't do that because there is none.
Well, one of the Trump doctrines is America first. Dr. Jeremias, we were talking the last few days about trust. Do you trust President Trump to continue to lead this brave new world order?
Thank you, Stephen. I think it's not about me trusting Donald Trump as the president-elect of America, but I think we're living in a multilateral world, and I still believe that we have to work all together in order to achieve results. Take alone big problems such as climate change. We're sitting all in the same boat, and Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group, one of my colleagues once, he argued in his G0 theory that the most pressing topics in the world today, they are too complex to be solved by any group of countries alone. So I would like to speak up in this regard for a strong Europe as one players among others to work on solutions to hopefully lead to a better world.
Okay, so we'll come to Europe, we'll come to the European Union a bit later. George Galloway, can we separate, do you think, anti-Trumpism from anti-Americanism?
Well, of course, I was not happy that Donald Trump was elected as the President of the United States, but I was very happy that Hillary Clinton wasn't, because I believe that the so-called rules-based order that she exemplified was very far from rules-based, because these so-called liberals, and ontology is important. I just heard Professor Siegel talk about something called ethno-nationalists. I don't know what that means. I don't know what they mean when they call someone like me a populist. Maybe they mean popular. You'll see how popular when the results of the elections in Britain on Sunday are announced, when the party I've been campaigning for wins a stunning victory and the Labour and Conservative parties are crushed, in the latter case, to nothingness. The Prime Minister will have resigned by the end of this day. So there's a big sweep going on, and the sweep is against what is called liberalism, though ask the people of Iraq just how liberal that rules-based order was. But whatever it is called, it is an era that is coming to an end. I'm a working class man from the same ethno-religious background as Steve Bannon, though we have many other differences. But our people, of whatever color, wherever they came from, however they pray, are asserting themselves. And the elite's day is done. And you'll see just how done in Europe late on Sunday night.
Okay, and I think George is right. We may well expect an announcement today that the Prime Minister of Great Britain will step down, not immediately, but perhaps in June. But I want to go to Mikhail Guzman. Mikhail, Joe Biden in America recently promised we will be back. Does that reflect a sort of longing to return to a world order that existed perhaps before President Trump started swinging his wrecking ball? What's the view from Moscow and TASS?
Thank you, Mr. Cole, for your question, but with your permission, I'll speak in Russian because this question was about Russia. Я не знаю, как пройдут.
I don't know what would the results be of elections in 1920 in the United States. The American people would once again make its choice. I believe that the situation in Russian-American relations is much deeper, irrespective of who specifically sits in the Oval Cabinet of the White House. I personally talked twice in the Oval Room with the Republican President George Bush Jr., and I also interviewed the Democratic Institute twice, Democratic President Obama. And I must say, from their perspective, from their plans, from their interests with regard to Russia, they were the same. But the fact is that the real politics, real circumstances, and the real life had led to somewhat different results. And in a similar manner, now in the pre-election time, we heard President Trump did have a lot of promises with regard to relations with Russia, but it never happened. We may talk for a long time why so, what caused that, and just quite recently, and Trump once again said that he is decisively for the development of relations with Russia. Unfortunately, so far, no concrete signals had been made so far. Moreover, in the wait for the summit meeting in Osaka, there was also an idea about a full format meeting. It was sounded by the American side in the format of two presidents. However, it's not happening. Moreover, State Secretary Pompeo did not bring these proposals to Moscow. So making any assumptions as to how the situation will develop in the event heroes change in the Oval Room, it's just impossible at this time.
Okay, thank you, Mikhail. Let's go to Benita. It's said that, I know President Obama, when he came to London, told Britain, you have to stay within the European Union. And this is a traditional view of the Americans, that they want Britain at the table to balance Brussels. How does Brussels, how does Europe, how do you as a commissioner view the relationship between Europe and America?
Well, first of all, let me say there is one thing that is clear, and I think we all agree. Indeed, the philosopher, the Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci says, the old is dying and the new is not yet born. And I think it's exactly that. We all know, in a matter of transformation, in a new geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geotechnological order. That's clear. But now, how do we tackle that? That's also different. And I'm in favor, and the European Union is in favor, of course, of a rules-based order. And I think Mogherini said it very rightly. She said, there is now a risk of the rule of the jungle and not the rule of rules-based international law. which is the basis for everything. If we are going out of that, then we will have struggles, conflicts, and in the end we might have wars. It is true that the international system has to be reformed, and I think there is the difference. Some say we have to throw it out and do something else, and we say we have to change it, we have to reform it, and of course, Britain should stay, according to our opinion, and also my personal opinion, within the European Union, and it was always a bridge to the United States of America. So I do hope that maybe there is a second referendum, and maybe there is a chance for Britain to come back.
Okay, Anna. Let's go to Anna Hagbian, who is First Lady in Armenia. Armenia is in a wonderful position in the center of Eurasia, if you like. How do you view what's happening between Brussels, Beijing, and Washington? Or are you focused on Armenia more than anything?
Thank you. Of course, we are not focused on Armenia, but I would like to talk about global trust and, most important, global distrust. Unfortunately, we do face lack of trust in the world. One may say that nowadays distrust rather than trust dominates the relationship between the states. For example, if the relationship between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran was based on trust, today we wouldn't be facing the danger of renewed crisis. If there was a little bit more trust in the relationship between the Russian Federation and the United States, then not only the citizens and people of those two countries would benefit, but also many other nations and people over the world. Then we wouldn't have new outbreaks of war and would successfully solve existing conflicts such as the one in Syria. So Armenia is not focused only on ourselves. We are looking globally on the world, and we have our own crisis, and we have our own crisis of trust and our conflict with our neighbor. So I think that renewed relationship between countries and relationship based on trust is very, very important nowadays globally for all the world.
What's the best way, Anna, of establishing trust?
I know ways. I'm acting for that point to succeed to that point, and I have an initiation in our country. It calls not in our country, globally. It calls Women for Peace. First of all, for our region and our conflict, and I think that people will trust to this initiative. At least people in Armenia and Azerbaijan, women in Armenia and Azerbaijan, we can regain a small bit of trust between our nations and go forward. I don't know, but I believe that it is possible.
Excellent. Well, that's good to hear. Jeremias, how do you establish trust, either nationally or internationally?
Thank you, Stephen. I think to develop trust, it's not enough to be interested in what holds the world together at its inner core, like Goethe used to say. But we need more. I think we need to have an interest in your opposite. We need to be more empathic again. And why is there not enough empathy in the world? I think it has also something to do with our education system. So we have to teach the kids out there that they need to be open-minded. They need to not look only at themselves and their own little world. And we're all living in a bubble somehow, But we need to look over this little...
Look outside our bubbles.
Outside, yes, exactly. And let me emphasize one more point. I think sports and cultural diplomacy as an instrument of any foreign policy is actually a really good tool to bridge people, no matter where they come from, what religion or culture they belong to. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure trust will be rearing its head quite frequently over the next hour or so. But we've sort of set the stage and we understand where the panelists are coming from. And we've talked a little about America. But I want to sort of move on to America's relationship with China. This is, at the moment, seen as the big head-to-head. Steve Bannon, you called China the greatest existential threat ever faced by the United States. Can you tell us more about why you think that?
It shouldn't be raising its head today. That's the problem. The problem is that the elites in this world, the capital markets guys from Frankfurt, the City of London, Wall Street, the international corporations, they've been running this scam for 20 years, financing and providing the technology to a radical cadre of the CCP that's built up this kind of Frankenstein monster that's essentially gutted the working class people throughout the world. Brexit and 2016 are inextricably linked. Why is that? It's a revolt by working class people, particularly in formerly heavily manufacturing countries, that live in a new serfdom, where you have this massive concentration of power, this massive concentration of wealth, and that the middle class and the working class, of which I come from a working class family, have been eviscerated. And there's not a bond of trust, because you shouldn't trust them. They're not trustworthy. This whole revolution that's going on now throughout the world that you're going to see on Sunday night that George Galloway just mentioned, it's working class people in the United States, in places like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, in places like Italy and France and the United Kingdom and others that are saying they've had enough, that they understand now, they're starting to understand what goes on. And what shocks me of the mainstream media, of all these organizations and all the money, you know, we've been beating this dead horse of this hoax of this Russian collusion with the Trump organization. For the last 20 years, the most significant story was the radicalization of the Chinese Communist Party to suppress their own people, the noble and decent people of the People's Republic of China, and turn it basically into slave labor for the West, so they can make goods for the corporatists at higher margins and sell it back to the unemployed and underemployed in the West. That day is over. What you saw with President Trump and others, we've now engaged in what we understand is an economic war against the industrial democracies, an economic war against working class people. And that war is by the radical cadre of the CCP, by Wall Street, by the City of London, and by the international corporations. And that is over.
Mark Siegel, there's no doubt China is an economic superpower. Is that the reason for President Trump's antagonism towards Beijing, a form of protectionism? They're worried about their own future?
Well, clearly China economically and politically is moving toward becoming a superpower. They have the second largest economy in the world today. It soon will be the first largest economy. Their military is not up to the military of the United States, but they're investing in modernization, while unfortunately the United States is spending $2 trillion on a new nuclear program for a war that never will be fought. But I think the main situation with China, and you know, you picked probably the one issue that you could have picked that I have remote agreement with President Trump about, is that there have been egregious trade policies that have gone untouched, probably because for the last 20 years we considered China a developing country and we closed our eyes to predatory economic policies. But I think if the negotiations between the United States and China succeed, and I don't know whether they will or not, although politically I think President Trump wants them to succeed, I don't think the solution is very difficult. A few large trade deals, some stoppage of some of the Chinese subsidization of their own companies so they can compete with American companies. And the whole question of intellectual property theft, I think there's no other way to describe it, it's theft that's gone unpunished. If those three things that I just mentioned are addressed in an economic trade agreement between the United States and China, I think we're moving to economically a normalized relationship. But the future of this century, I think, is going to be it's going to be not unipolar but multipolar. I don't think it'll just be China and the United States, but I think Europe and possibly separately Eurasia. There might be four poles to the end of this century.
Benita, how does Europe regard the US trade war with China?
Well, first of all, of course, we do understand that China has not fulfilled everything what they should have done. That means there are state-owned companies that get subsidies. There is indeed the intellectual property question. There are other questions about market access. All of that is also important to us, and indeed is also in the negotiations between President Juncker and also the Chinese. But we have a different approach. We don't want a trade war. We would like to find solutions through negotiations, but it's absolutely necessary that we have a global playing field that is the right one, the equal one for everybody. This goes for the United States too. So what we think is, indeed, United States and China will be, or they are already, strategic competitors, and China is, of course, becoming, or is nearly there, as a superpower already. So for the United States, it's difficult. They have been dominating the world after Second World War, especially after the fall of communism. So now, to understand that, but we fear, and we are always a community that wants peace and try to do things with peaceful means. So we fear there might be once the so-called trap of Thucydides. That means that there might even be a real military conflict. This is what we have to avoid. This is our position.
Well, but what role do you see Europe playing in avoiding this possible military confrontation? Because at the moment, the European Union seems to lack any diplomatic clout whatsoever. I think it was Juncker who said, nobody's taking us seriously in foreign policy anymore.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is true. I agree with that. I think we have to have stronger leaders in Europe, but we particularly have to have more unity, more effective way of doing things, and more rapid. And for that, we have to reform the European Union. I have a lot of ideas. I already wrote them in my book. But I think the most important is indeed that we are there on a cooperative level, but also on a clear level. We have to be tough and clear, but we should not go to trade war.
George Galloway, trade war, two economic superpowers opposing economic visions, growing geopolitical rivalries, deep mutual suspicions. Sometimes trade wars can morph into Cold Wars, and when you have Cold Wars, what happens is people have to choose sides. This all looks potentially dangerous, doesn't it?
There have been egregious trade policies because it suited the elites in the West to have them. They don't care if the workers' lunch is stolen by China or anyone else, because they're sitting at a banquet at the expense of the workers both in China and in their own countries. The great English man of letters, Dr. Johnson, said, "There is no dictatorship so grim as the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy." And it's that prevailing orthodoxy that many of us on the left and on the right are now challenging. So my view on your question, Stephen, is China's fully entitled as a sovereign country to pursue its own interests and its own policies. And so is the United States. But both should do so in the knowledge that the fearsome potential of trade war to become real war is a clear and present danger to everyone. Now, the United States is not going to war with China. That would be exceedingly foolish. But it might be steaming towards a war with Iran. And I'm here to tell them, as someone who warned them about the consequences of war with Iraq, that a war against Iran will be 10, 50, 100 times more destabilizing, more dangerous than the war with Iraq even has been.
George.
So I call for cool heads, for proper negotiation between two great sovereign countries, the United States and China, pursuing their own interest, but mindful of the fact that everybody's lunch might not just be stolen, but the entire dining table turned upside down and the houses within it.
And you're right to mention Iran. I'll ask you about Iran a bit later. I want to sort of continue this antagonism, this theme of antagonism between the two countries, which, for all we know, could be solved in the next few weeks with a deal, a trade war deal. Mikhail Gushman, do you agree?
Ну, with the permission, I'll continue in Russian. Дело в том, что я принадлежу
As a matter of
поколению
fact,
людей,
I belong to the generation of people who, in their old childhood, were singing the songs Stalin and Mao are thinking about us. Then the time came when the Soviet Union had a military conflict with China. It's the only country. We have the representatives of all other countries sitting here. They never had it. However, many years were required after that incident, and the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping and Mikhail Gorbachev led to the change of the situation. And it should be realized that among the United States and China, there are like tens of thousands of kilometers, and we have about 10,000 kilometers of shared border. And our relations with China is a special story. We are in this great country of Kazakhstan. I would like to use this chance and thank the organizers for this brilliant forum, but we should understand the situation of Kazakhstan that shares a long border with China, and Kazakhstan is a strategic partner of Russia for many years to come, I think. And in this connection, the context of Russian-Chinese relations is totally different from the context of US-China relations. For our relations with China are of strategic value. It's a day-to-day value to us, and therefore building relations between Russia and China goes beyond trade relationships only or purely trade interaction. That's a more serious strategic problem.
Does, Mikhail, you think, does Washington fear a Russia-China axis, a closer relationship? As President Trump is coming to London to have afternoon tea with the Queen at Buckingham Palace, then President Xi is going to Russia to talk to President Putin. And the eyes of the world will be perhaps split between afternoon tea and détente.
Ну, если вспомним...
Well, if we remember the hospitality of President Trump accepting Chairman Xi at his house, I wouldn't say that there was any fear. I remember at that very point they were having dinner at President Trump's residency, and the President Trump gave a command to launch an attack against the Syrians at that point. I think that in the context of the missions that President Trump defined during his election campaign, Mr. Bannon will not let me lie there, he had the intention to stop the Chinese expansion. As far as he sees it and understands it, this Chinese trade attacks, the way he manages to withstand that and whether that will work, we will see at the end of this cadence.
Benita, I want to come to Steve Bannon in a second, but I'll come to you before Steve. In Europe, the idea of a potential Russia threat is perhaps more easily understood in Brussels and Britain, but the concept of China being a threat is harder to comprehend, isn't it?
I would say for a certain time, I think you're right, because indeed we have member states that are much closer to Russia and also fear Russia sometimes. Unfortunately, this is the case. I always thought that we should have to come to terms with Russia, although, of course, we are all appalled by what has happened in the Crimea and also in the eastern part of Ukraine. But I think there is a possibility, there is the Minsk agreement, so there are possibilities if both sides indeed implement those agreements. But indeed, China is much further away. But in the meantime, we are not naive. We also have seen the strategic competition that's going on. And I say strategic because it's not only economic. The Road and Belt Initiative is a very interesting one, but it could also go for, I would say, military strategic purposes in the future. So I think we have understood very well what's there. But as I said, our instruments are different than those of the United States in this moment. We don't want to go to trade war, but there are also possibilities. There might be sanctions, but hopefully we come to negotiations. But I wanted to say a word to Mr. Galloway, because this has come up all the time. I also think that in our societies, with globalization and digitalization, indeed, there are losers and winners. The winners, that's okay. But for the losers, we will have to do something in the future. And that, for me, is the recipe also to go against populism and nationalism. Because people think they hide where they think they have more secure possibilities to also influence policy, where they think European Union is so far away, or any other high supreme power is so far away that they cannot do anything. But that will be important. So I'm in favor, for instance, of a social union also in the future among ourselves, but also more social, and I'm a Christian Democrat, but for more social remedies in our societies.
Okay. Now, one last question to Steve Bannon, unless, George, you want to reply to that?
Madame, why should someone living in a rust belt, and I assure you, much of England, much of Wales, and much of Scotland are rust belts, why would someone living in a rust belt vote for the status quo? I'm afraid you're decades too late. Jacques Delors may still extraordinarily be alive, but Delorsism is dead. The European Union is a club for the better and the betterment of the European elite. And the people of Britain have seen it. And yesterday they spoke, and what they said will be counted on Sunday. You're in for a very rude awakening.
Thank you, George. Well, Benito said briefly, but I want to go to Jeremias after you, and then Steve.
Just wanted to say it was Britain's policy, not the European policy, that made those people, so to say, low people in the Rust Belt.
Okay, well, we'll talk about the European Union again in a second, but Jeremias, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to answer and give you one number. As a united Europe, today's Europe represents only 6% of the world's population. So if we take it back to a foreign policy point of view, and I agree that we're kind of a toothless tiger, but again, I want to emphasize that we have to work together. And I understand all these concerns, and people are afraid of change in the first place because they are hurt by the change. But if you take it to the international stage, I mean, in order to have a say as Europe, maybe together with all the new partners like Eurasia, like countries like Kazakhstan, we have to work together. There is no other way.
Thank you, Jeremias. Steve Bannon, you've heard a lot of contrary arguments. Just to finish the discussion about China before we move on, do you think Washington would like to lever Moscow and Beijing apart? And China seems to have a global strategy, but I don't see any evidence of a US global strategy.
If you don't see it, then you haven't been paying attention. I want to go back to this for a second. This is the problem. This is why there's a revolt. This whole thing of globalization. The elites use that as a cover. Globalization, this whole thing of the globalized world and globalization was nothing more than to find the cheapest source of labor. They treat it like the second law of thermodynamics, like it's some physical property that can't be undone. That is a lie. This all came about through human agency. The City of London, Wall Street, and the corporations will always look for higher margins, and therefore they will always look for the lowest source of wages. You talk about trust. Here's where the fear is. Fear is not in the work. When I go around working class people, you see them starting to unite. You see this vote. You see it in Italy. You see it in France. You see it in the United Kingdom. You're starting to see it in Germany. You certainly see it in the United States. The fear is in the party of Davos and its political apparatchiks in Brussels and all the happy talk that goes along with them. They sat around and made all the money. The Thucydides trap. Thucydides trap is that you're declining power to the rising power. The industrial democracies of the West are not a declining power. That is a lie. The way we got into this is our elites thought it was too hard to confront a radical cadre, another dictatorship. Just like in the 1930s, the same elites would not confront it. It took working class people to confront it. And who were our allies? Russia and China. Russia and China. The great fascist wars.
Okay, let's...
Hang on one second, please.
Briefly, Steve.
Well, there's just so much happy talk. You know, this is a world revolution going on right now. And you have to see reality of what reality is. And no, I don't think in Washington, President Trump in the West, I think you're starting to see devolved a very thought-through plan. And the United States does not want to be an imperial power. We're not looking for protectorates. Working class people in the United States are looking for allies in the West, in the Judeo-Christian West, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in China. The greatest ally we're ever going to have is old 100 names, the working class people in China. Thanks.
Does that mean, Mark Siegel, that what Steve is saying, that the US doesn't want to be an imperial power? Has the US had enough of interventions and is starting to look inward now more than outward? Because I saw the millennial generation, and we're all soon going to be irrelevant, ladies and gentlemen, because the millennials are coming through, and they have a different view. They don't like the idea of more defense spending. They don't like the idea, according to polls anyway, of interventions. So is America looking inwards, not outwards now?
Well, the Pew data does support what you're saying. Millennials are looking less abroad and more internally. They're also aligning with the Democratic Party 3-1 over the Republican Party, which seems inconsistent with some of the things that Steve has been talking about. But I think one of the questions that we have to face is the Trump administration's allergy to multilateralism and going it alone and walking away from agreements and walking away from international law. On Monday, for instance, this Monday, President Trump is going to pardon war criminals, people convicted of war crimes, violating U.S. military code and the Geneva Convention. What kind of a message is that to the world or to the young people of America about trust and respect for law? I think we have the same kind of situation with the Iran agreement. Just rip it up. We see that over and over again. The coherence of his policy. Steve says there is a plan, but if you just look at foreign policy and military policy, the president is a neo-isolationist, and his national security advisor is a unilateral interventionist. And these are in the White House. These are the two people that are trying to make policy. Well, there is no process in the White House. Steve was there. There is no decision-making process in the White House because President Trump makes policy by whim, by tweet, without a process of developing economic or military or political ideas. It's very difficult for the world to deal with this kind of environment and trust the United States. I mean, why should anyone negotiate with the United States if the United States just rips up agreements left and right? Why should North Korea negotiate a treaty with the United States when Iran negotiated a treaty with the United States and now it's just ripped up and destroyed? That's what I mean by incoherence.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Let's go to nationalism. Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said, I think yesterday or the day before, that if you don't love your country, you're kind of weird. He said the challenge to Europe's internationalist consensus was maybe good for debate. What have you been hearing, Steve, over the last few months as you've toured Europe?
Well, I think nationalism is nothing more than a reassertion of the Westphalian system. And the reason nationalism, in this populist nationalist revival we've seen, or this revolt that you've seen starting in Brexit and through Trump and now into the European parliamentary elections, Australia, other places, I'd actually say Modi in India, is that people understand, citizens understand that the highest amount of control they could possibly have is at the nation state level, not at some amorphous, transnational level where you end up having guys like Juncker and people like Juncker, dictating to you how your life is going to be lived. That's being rejected. That's going to really be rejected on Sunday night. Macron laid out in his Renaissance project the natural, logical conclusion of the United States of Europe, where these nations will become basically administrative units, like states in the United States. That is being rejected by the European people. You see a rise in nationalism, and a rise in nationalism is positive. It's what unites people. It gives citizens the best level of control. In Europe, they're not looking to break up the EU. They're actually looking to have a stronger Europe with a Europe of nations, reporting to a free citizenry. And I think you're going to see a whole era of peace and prosperity start to come as we have more nationalism and more focus on the citizen controlling their politicians and not these kind of centralized bureaucracies like you have in Brussels and in Washington, D.C.
Steve, I think that saying that this populist movement unites people is absolutely wrong. It's designed, and its strategy is to divide people into us and them. By color, by ethnicity, by background, by language spoken, it's us and them. And we found the same thing in the United States with the campaign that you ran successfully because of states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania.
Why was that? Because we gave working class people the Democratic junta, the Democratic Party junta, the globalists, tied to Wall Street, the Wall Street faction, right? They were your voters and your people that voted for us, just like it was Labor that were the deciding votes in Brexit. Working class people have had a belly full of the lies and the misrepresentations. And now they're actually seeing people that will start to unite and bring jobs back. This is not about ethnicity. This is not about race. That's the cheap smear that's been on it. And here's the beauty of it. People know they're not nativists. They know they're not xenophobes. They know they're not racist. And it's working class people and middle class people that are rejecting that.
George Galloway?
These are just insults that are, it's a kind of the mother of all smokescreens, to coin a phrase. I was very careful earlier when I said, our people, whatever color they are, wherever they came from, however they pray, it's about democracy, not nationalism. Steve Bannon is right. The only way that you have any chance of controlling the elites and the monopolies and the exploiters is on a nation-state level, because everything else is either too big or, in the case of the European Union, the rules, the constitution are rigged in advance so that no democracy can influence or affect them. And I say to Professor Siegel, if the Democratic Party had not rigged the primary system to pick the elite choice, Hillary Clinton, rather than Bernie Sanders, we'd be talking here today about President Sanders, not President Trump. It was another classic example of the elite overreaching. They think, they'll, I think differently come Monday. They think that we're fools and that by throwing out words like racist, I have 4 mixed-race children and an Indonesian wife sitting there. I've been a lifetime on the left, and I'm accused of being a racist. I'm accused of even worse than that, the F word, the N word. It doesn't work anymore. And you'll discover Sunday night, Monday morning, that the revolution is on. And it's not about color, not about race. It's about class. It's about the mass of the people saying to the elite, we've had enough of you. For all the good that you're doing, in the name of God, go.
Mr. Galloway, your view of the Democratic delegate selection process is basically ignorant and absurd. Hillary Clinton got 57% of the primary vote cast in 2016, and Mr. Sanders got 43%. That's the people speaking. We're talking about tens of millions of people participating in a system, not a back room of Democratic leaders picking the outcome.
Okay. Now we've solved the vagaries of the last presidential election. I want to stay with Europe again, and I want to blame the European Union beneath us, because Europe's share of the world's population and wealth is shrinking. That's undoubted. The EU is divided, maybe north and south, and certainly east. It lacks strong leadership. That's the view from outside the Union. Does all that contribute to the upsurge in nationalism or populism?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I'm not, of course, I'm absolutely not on the same level as Mr. Galloway. And I want to tell you one thing. First of all, it is the nation states still that can do their laws on all the question of social conditions. They do things on economy. Where I do think the 2 or 3 major reasons for nationalism and populism is 1, loss of jobs. But loss of jobs is particularly because of globalization and because of manufacturing going away. 1. 2, I think, is fear of migration. And here I agree, it's particularly the economic part of the migration. In my country, Austria, people that come in and get asylum status get everything for free afterwards. They have education free, they have health care for free, and a person in a supermarket that pays taxes gets more or less the same as a person that comes in. So that, for the people, is too much. And then they think that the nation state can help them because they know that better, as I said before. But coming to the European Union, it's true, there is a lack of leadership, I agree. And it's also true that for the moment there is a great fragmentation. Why? Because the countries from the East, unfortunately, have not shown the same solidarity as they should have, as we have shown towards them. Germany, Austria, Sweden, etc. We are net payers. We have been paying all the infrastructure for them and so on. Cohesion funds, structural funds. I think the least would have been that they also take in migrants, not only Germany, Sweden, Austria, and so on.
Well, according to the European Commission's own data, when voters are asked to choose their top 2 issues or fears, one is immigration and the other is terrorism. Now,
well, terrorism is a second thing, but I think for terrorism, the Union has been doing much more, and also, it's true, there are many issues that the 28 or maybe 27 in the future will have to tackle much better. And this is also security, but I think now there will be a defense fund, there will be a defense agency, and for the first time, indeed, the defense union will at least have initial steps. I agree with you. I would like to have the union to be much quicker. But the decision-making also will have to change. We have had...
There's a lot to change.
Yes.
There's a long list.
Yes, indeed. And therefore I said it has to be reformed. Indeed, where you see that people are unsatisfied, you have to do something about it.
But again...
But not in the radical form as, for instance, Mr. Bannon and Mr. Galloway want.
But Steve Bannon and George Galloway are both right, aren't they, in saying the politicians aren't listening to the voters. I mean, that was the accusation against Angela Merkel. and why she's finished her career early, that she didn't listen to what her constituency was telling her.
Well, I think she made a
Are there any
mistake.
signs?
She made a mistake, and that, of course, now the consequences are there.
That's
She
one
should have
example.
thought that she cannot decide for everybody else. That is absolutely true. Therefore, I said migration is one of the big issues. But migration also has already been mitigated once, and second, solutions are slowly, I agree, slowly underway. We are too slow. That is one of the issues that I always have been criticizing.
And if the politicians don't listen to the voters, you'll see a continued rise of populism and nationalism?
Yes, of course. And I also want to say the Union has to go back to the big questions. There we have to be quicker. We have to have vote not by unanimity, but by qualified majority. I have been for that for a long time. We also should have a smaller commission. And there are other things that can be done even with a treaty. But the small things, the things that are really important to people, they should stay in the nation states. And there is the subsidiarity. It's called subsidiarity. But it has not always been respected.
Okay. Anna?
Thank you. I want to state that nationalism is very important for every nation nowadays in the world because, you know, Armenia is a nation which has overcome genocide, and we survived because of high feeling of nationalism in these days. And unfortunately, such kind of dangers exist now in these decades and days, and nations cannot lose their nationalism, feeling of their nationalism. The thing is not in that the problem is not nationalism, but the way how we feel ourselves, how we cooperate with each other, and how are we going to solve problems between nations and countries. And the same thing I would like to add about it. I would like to go back to the relationship between Russia and China. I want to say that this is not about Russia, not the United States and China. And it's a fact that China has become a challenge for the United States, but I think that it's the time for United States to go to solve problems, not through confrontation, but cooperation. And as it was here mentioned very smoothly, it is not only about confrontation between United States and China, but Russia one day will be involved in this confrontation, and it will be very, very dangerous for all the world. Thank you.
Anna, thank you. Now, I think it may be time to go to the audience. And we have some questions. This gentleman here has his hand up at the front. Now, what I'd like, before you ask your question, can you identify who you are?
Sure, of course.
And
this
also,
is my intention. Okay.
And also to who you would like the question addressed to.
Exactly. So Boris Ruku is my name. I'm coming from Slovenia, EU. And I would like to address my question in relation to crisis of trust to Mr. Galloway. George, Brexit, is this from the perspective of ordinary people a way how to cheat the people with the referendum? Is this the political experiment or a political mistake? I would like to have your personal, really trustful answer to that. Thank you.
Well, I was one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, and we won. We won 52 to 48. But amongst the working class, we won 67% of the vote. So this was a revolt of the working class at the first opportunity of doing so, with the battlefield clear. All the experts, all the oligarchs, all the big city finance money, all the media, all the mandarins of Whitehall, all the political class, telling the people they would be idiots to vote for Brexit. All the experts were rejected. And the last 3 years, that same coalition of interests have tried to stop Brexit, wreck Brexit. And so we were forced to tell them again. And although the counting is underway, I can confidently say to you that we will again have won a stunning victory. And in the Rust Belt amongst the workers, the result will be even greater than the Brexit victory was. It's not that Brexit is a sufficient condition to make a better Britain, but it is a necessary one. It is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition of moving forward with a better Britain, that we leave the elites of the EU to fiddle whilst Rome burns. The more I listened to Benita, the more I recalled the words of the late and great railwayman's leader, Bob Crow. If my auntie had balls, she'd be my uncle. If we do all these things, says Benita, then things can be better. Well, it's too little and it's too late. These fly swats that she talked of, at the same time as you're investing in agencies to fight terrorism, you're actually helping to, instead of allying with Russia to crush terrorism in Syria, the Western governments, the EU governments, were arming, financing, and proselytizing for terrorism in Syria. Too little, madame, and way too late.
And what did Britain do?
The same.
What did Britain do?
The same, because we have
I mean,
had the same elite governance as you. But we're getting ready to sweep it away.
It's the foreign ministers who take decisions. It's not the EU as such.
All of
so
you.
I think
a plague on all of your houses.
Excuse me.
You're all finished. From
Excuse
London
me.
to Frankfurt to Berlin,
I think
you're all finished.
The gentleman was right when he said you cheated a lot in this election, and the young people, unfortunately, didn't go to the vote. Of course, always.
So we're
those
fools.
Who,
We're back
excuse
to
me.
we're either racists or we're fools, or both.
Let you talk.
Actually,
let me talk?
actually, the people have now spoken. Get ready for hearing the result.
You know, shouting is not good arguments. I just say that.
Thank you both. And thank you for the question. Gentleman over there.
Please calm down. This is not war, ladies and gentlemen. I have, my name is Sungwon Choi, and from South Korea. I want to ask to Steve Bannon. So, Steve, how do you expect the result of the next presidential election? Well, President Trump will win the election. So, and what would be the biggest obstacle to Trump's victory? Except you are not there.
Well, you might be there, mightn't you, Steve? Or not?
No, I'm very happy where I am now. Look, I think it's going to be a very, very, very difficult campaign. I anticipate, I believe, because of the economic results, and it now is engagement with China and other spots around the world, that President Trump's going to win. But it's going to be very tough, but winnable. But here's what I like about it. It's going to be fought in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa. The upper Midwest, the Rust Belt of the United States, is going to determine the next president of the United States. And so even if President Trump, if one of the Democrats gives him a run for the money, they're going to have to convince working class people that their policies are going to work. And so I think this is going to be a very tough race. I anticipate President Trump is going to win. I actually could see how he could actually win with more electoral votes than last time. But the one difference, and I think this is a very positive difference, the globalist elite of the Hillary Clinton junta, right, has been, you know, I hopefully put back, and I think that you're going to see real address. That's how we won last time. We won with Democratic votes. And this time, I think it's going to be a real fight for those votes. And I anticipate that President Trump's going to win, but stand by, it's going to be tough.
I'd like a crack at that. Last November, the states that Steve is talking about, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, elected Democratic governors. The Democrats had 10%, a victory across the country of 10%. The latest poll that came out yesterday in Pennsylvania has Joe Biden beating the president by 11 points.
Brother Siegel's absolutely correct. You look at the 2018 election, and this is why I didn't work in the campaign, but I advise you got to focus on those issues. If you nationalize the House races, which is the way I think you'd do it, President Trump lost 52-46 because he didn't make it a referendum on himself, and he lost by 8 million votes, and that's going to be that the 18 race shows that the Democrats can mobilize. And
okay, we're off message now because I want to get back to our core questions here. Lady there, what is your question? Is it about trust and global powers?
Yes.
Good.
Shalom, salam alaikum. I'm Shosh from Israel. The question is for all of you. Is someone have a good suggestion to build trust between Israel and the Palestinians?
All right. First of all, I'll go to George Galloway. And anybody else want to come in on this question, Middle East? Okay, well, it'll just be George who will answer your question.
Only a recognition of the historic injustice in the lifetime of many people still alive that has been visited upon the Palestinian people. A recognition of their nationhood, a recognition of their right to exist as a people, a recognition of the right of the Palestinian refugees, which numbered 800,000 in the beginning, now number 10 million, of their legal and moral right to return to their homelands. There will be no peace. We have a slogan, madam, it's an uncomfortable one. No justice, no peace. Until there's justice for the Palestinian people, there will be no peace.
I'd like to take a crack at that.
Mark, yep.
That was, this return to the homeland means that there would be no Jewish state in Israel. Now, I agree that there should be a two-state solution.
I thought you were against ethno-states.
Let me talk for a second, because the whole world is talking about the occupation of the West Bank. No one is talking about 12 million Muslims in Kashmir being occupied by India.
My goodness, you've changed.
No one is talking about 3 million Muslims in concentration camps in China. This is selective application of international standards and human rights, and it's absurd. It's absurd. What you just talked about.
You see what lies beneath the liberal?
Mr. Galloway, what you just discussed.
You've been railing against ethno-religious states, and now you're supporting one.
It was the elimination of the state of Israel. That's what you described.
Let me finish for the moment. All right, thank you. The question at the back. But just before you ask that question, George, very quietly, Iran is part of your remit. There does seem to be increasing tension between the US and Iran. Possible flashpoint, end of the nuclear deal. Where is that leading? And are we seeing something extremely serious in terms of a collision course? But briefly, if you will, because I want to stay with the floor.
I don't know what you mean by part of my remit. I have nothing whatsoever to do with Iran.
You know about the subject.
I do. I just wanted to avoid any doubt on that question.
That would never come into the question.
It's an extremely dangerous situation. Thanks to the destruction of Iraq, against which I advised, as you know, Iran has become very much more powerful than it was hitherto. If you destroy the Arab power in Baghdad, you make the Persian power in Tehran much more important and strong. So a war with Iran will be the biggest mistake in history. It will literally open the gates of hell. Iran is a young country, a big country, and will, under attack, be a united country. It has military capacity of great strategic importance in the Straits of Hormuz. If the United States or its proxies attack Iran, the oil fields of all America's friends in the Persian Gulf will be on fire within the hour. The Straits of Hormuz will be blocked within a day, and the wheels of industry everywhere in the world will immediately cease to turn. So I caution against it. I hope that President Trump can rein in the buffoon, the mustachioed buffoon, John Bolton, before it's too late and before the world is dragged into an even bigger disaster than the war on Iraq was.
Thank you, George. A question from the gentleman here? Yeah, it's on.
Hi, my name is Shalkan Ruseyev. I'm a media consultant here in Almaty. My question goes to Mr. Bannon. Mr. Bannon, after leaving the White House, you have been supportive of nationalists and populism in Europe, and now you have been actively involved in elections. You also established a platform, the movement, to support European nationalist efforts to take on the establishment. And we also, in Eurasia, have the wave of nationalism and populism. We also have fear, and we also have anger by the people, by ordinary citizens. But the problem with Eurasian nationalism, including Central Asian, people, ordinary citizens, lack a very important tool, democratic tool. They cannot affect on the election outcomes. I was wondering, are you interested in the rise of economic nationalism or populism in Eurasia, including Central Asia? Thank you.
That's the reason I came here, absolutely. I'm interested throughout the entire world, including Central Asia, Southeast Asia, China. Populism and nationalism is our future. I think the debate in the future will be between the George Galloways and people on the right is that how much state intervention do you have in the economics? I'm a capitalist, and I believe that capitalism properly managed and monitored is the way forward, is the way that the little guy can get the best, most prosperous life, the most peaceful life. Others, Bernie Sanders and AOC and Elizabeth Warren and other populists on the left in the United Kingdom and throughout Europe believe that more state intervention. So no, I'm a huge believer that this is a new wave. I've been spending a lot of time around Latin America, particularly in Brazil and some other places where you see the rise of populist nationalist leaders. So no, I'm extremely interested in Central Asia and extremely interested in all Asia. I have a great affinity. I went to Asia as a very young man as a naval officer. I was on a destroyer and a carrier battle group off of Iran in 1979 during the hostage situations. I know how terrible that is and how difficult it is. I agree with Mr. Galloway and a lot of his comments on Iran. So no, I'm very interested, and I think come Sunday night, people in Central Asia and throughout the world are going to see where working class people in Europe who were mocked and ridiculed just a couple of years ago are starting to take active control of their countries and active control of their lives.
Just before I take that question, Mark Siegel, again going back to America, I'm afraid, but this attempt, well, because it's narrow sort of a view, not a global view. But Mr. Trump's war against Iran, tearing up the nuclear deal, is he doing that at the behest of Saudi Arabia?
Well, the president's son-in-law is very close to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, so people speculate that. But President Trump has been against that treaty during the campaign all along. He and Bibi Netanyahu are the two leaders against the treaty, and I think that was not a surprise that President Trump dumped the Iranian treaty, but I think it's still a very dangerous move.
Yeah, thank you for that. The question over there, gentleman over there.
Javid Ismail,
Chief Editor-in-Chief of the Azerbaijani Information Agency, ONA. I have a question to Madam Anna Akopyan. In your intervention, you talked about creating confidence and creating the spheres of confidence between women of Azerbaijan and Armenia. You and your husband, the president of Armenia, were against the regime of Kacharyan and Sarkisyan, who usurped the power in Armenia for about 20 years. What is interesting is that you sent your son to serve the military service in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is not an officially recognized and internationally recognized territory of Armenia. Mr. Pashinyan, on the 8th of May...
I wonder if I could stop you there. Could you, rather than make a statement, could you ask your question?
I'm not making a statement. It's a question. My question is related to this. Mr. Pashinyan, on the 8th of May, during the occupation of the Armenian city, traveled there and spoke to the cameras. Do you think it's possible to create confidence between Azerbaijan and Armenia based on those actions on the part of Yerevan and your family in person? Is it in the spirit of settling the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? And my second question, what is it that we can do in order to establish the
The first question's enough. Anna.
Thank you for your question. I don't want to enter to the details and to the politics. I'm here as a woman, and my message is as a woman and mother. But I want to say you that we are still in conflict. The war is not over. That's why our son is serving in the army in Nagorno-Karabakh. So my message is to start to trust each other and to start to think about solving this conflict through negotiations, not war. You know that in 2016 there was initiated a big war in the border by the Azerbaijani side, and we had lost hundreds of young people from both sides. And my message is not to repeat the same, never repeat the same, and to start to think about resolving this conflict through negotiations. Armenian side never started war, and if you are talking about messages coming from our family or Armenian side, you have to remember messages and speeches from the government, your government, from the Ilham Aliyev side, and they are. You know better than me how what kind of hostility resists in his speeches. So I want to repeat that my message is to start to hate each other. It's very difficult. I know, and I'm sure it's very difficult, but it's not impossible. And like other conflicts, it's already 30 years that we are in this conflict, and we can be all our lives. It's important. It's possible, but it's not a good way to exist and to live. So I think that if women and mothers, first for the beginning, as women and mothers can give the same message to the political decision makers, to the negotiators, to the Minsk group coordinators, never again let the war come true, and try to solve the problem through negotiations, we will come to a point. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Gentleman here.
Yeah. Excuse me, I'm from Kazakhstan. My name is Kayat Abusitov. First of all, I would like just to return back and to finish this, the prelude to this particular moment discussion. And I'm totally agree with some of the panelists of this session, because which is targeting, first of all, the Palestinian and saying what they are doing now. Because what they are doing now, they are doing everything which is in norms and principles with the UN Charter and international law. Because we have some principles, and the first principle, this is a principle of the right of the people who are under occupation for struggle. The reason is not in the Palestinian. The reason of thinking in the all norms and principles what we have now in the international law and UN Charter. Because we have a big contradiction between these principles. First of all, between the principle of territorial integrity, all self-determination.
Is there a question here? Is there a question? We're going to have a speech.
I did.
Yes, please.
Ask a question. I don't need a speech. Just ask a question.
Okay. It's just the first part of my thinking for this time being.
Just ask a question.
Yes, please.
You got thousands of people here want to ask it. Don't make a speech. You want to make a speech outside.
No.
Ask a question so these other people
Mr. Bannon, my question absolutely to you. Because what I'm here now, this is absolutely conceptual shock. Because of, you said, just one moment before, you said...
Can I get the question?
You said you are capitalist. But what is a capitalism today? We have a lot of...
Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay.
What is a capitalism for today? We have the responsible capitalism, we have the green capitalism, we have new Keynes capitalism.
What you want to
What's
know?
your thinking about the capitalism today?
All right, lovely. Thank you. That's a good question. Steve.
Yeah, I think where you don't allow it to have concentration of power, I think where you don't allow it to get out of control, where you have this kind of permanent political class and elite, and kind of this merger between state capitalism and government. And this is what you're seeing in China today, right? This is what you're seeing in various aspects of the West. That has to be broken up. Entrepreneurial capitalism, where the little guy gets a shot, is the best form of capitalism. And that's what the future can hold. And that is the best way to empower working class people and middle class people, is to break up the concentrated power of the media companies, the concentrated power of the industrial companies, the concentrated power of these Wall Street and City of London investment houses, investment banks. You do that and you've opened up the possibility of true freedom for working class people.
All right, thank you, Steve.
Thank you for your speech, too.
Over there. The gentleman here is the last question.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. My name is Veeramal Anjaya. I am from Indonesia. I am representing the Jakarta Post English newspaper. My question to both Mr. Bannon and Madam Benita. This is regarding the South China Sea. Because not only the US, in Southeast Asia, we have been facing a big threat from China. Because China is a big claimant in the South China Sea. So my question is, why this South China Sea issue is not prominent if you compare to the Iran, because Asia is the biggest continent. It is a rising power, 4 billion people.
Well, your question is, why is it not more in the news?
That is an absolute brilliant question. And
it is, I agree, a very good question. But you want Steve to answer, and who else?
It's a brilliant question, and I happen to believe not Iran, and not Venezuela, and not the North German plane with the Russians. The single most dangerous, and not North Korea and the Northwest Pacific, the single most dangerous place in the world, and the place where the next war could start unless we're very wise about how we handle it, is the South China Sea. And this is the provocation of the expansionist power of this radical cadre of the CCP that built those islands and had the Democratic Party and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and that whole gang had the Munich of the 21st century when they allowed those stationary islands, which are basically aircraft carriers, to be built. This is the central issue, I think, of freedom in the world, the free navigation of the South China Sea, and the dismantling of those islands that the Chinese Communist Party, the radical cadre of Wan Xishan and Xi, have put down there to make the South China Sea an internal sea of the radical cadre of the CCP. And this is where the European Union looked the other way. This is where Obama looked the other way. This is where Joe Biden looked the other way. This is where the Democratic Party looked the other way. This is not where Donald Trump, he is not looking the other way. The other day we sent a destroyer within 10 miles of one of those islands.
Benita, the European Union has been looking the other way?
Well, indeed, we have not put this on the major screen, so to say. But of course, it shows that China also is indeed, as I said before, extending strategically. And I also agree that this is one of the important issues. But one of the other important issues where we are now very disappointed with Mr. Trump's action is North Korea. This was the only point where I thought he's doing a good thing when there was the meeting. But the way he did it was unfortunately not a good one. And so I think we are not only, excuse me, let me finish. There was not only the possibility of having done something to really approach the situation in a more positive way, but, to sit down with a leader and, say a few things and then not have your own people working on it and a second time already have something ready was a great failure. Besides, I wanted to say, we are also in the European Union, as you all know, totally against this dumping of the nuclear treaty with Iran. We were in favor of it. We have been negotiating for many, many years, and we think it's a great danger. And third, on Palestine and Israel, I think we have the resolutions in the Security Council. A two-state solution would be the just and right solution, and it's a pity that this has been totally neglected. So again, rule of law, international order has to be there, otherwise there might be wars and wars and wars.
Thank you.
Just very briefly about North Korea, and this shows you the haplessness of the European Union. It was the Clinton, the Bush, the Obama administration, and the haplessness, complete, total haplessness of the EU and all the happy talk that allowed North Korea to get the ballistic missile technology and all the nuclear warhead technology they got, okay, for 30 years, right? All this great negotiating power, all this rule of law, all this great stuff. You had a criminal junta putting together a nuclear plant. North Korea is a vassal state of Beijing. And that is President Trump is handling these negotiations. We've made more progress with North Korea in confronting these issues and with Beijing in President Trump's tenure than the 30 years of haplessness between the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and our partners in the EU. They're the ones that created and allowed North Korea to be created and be the great threat to Japan and South Korea it is.
Okay, thank you, Steve. One last question from over there. This is the last question, and keep it brief if you will, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir. First of all, my question is to Mr. Bannon. I'm a director of Institute of World Economics and Politics. I'm from Nur-Sultan, the capital of Kazakhstan. So my question is this. You said that in one of your speeches that China is a major threat to the Western industrial democracy. So today, the policy of the United States toward China is like, could be described as containment, or you're trying to contain China in some sense. But how would you describe in this situation, the situation between Russia and the West? How would you describe the policy toward Russia? If Russia, in your view, is a declining power and China is a rising power, why are you still pressuring Russia? And it's a very important question for us because we are a part of the economic union with Russia and we are affected by these old situations. And it's also not easy for us to see these rising tensions between China and the United States because China is a big investor in Kazakhstan too.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd be very cautious, particularly in the One Belt, One Road and other aspects. All China is doing is they're taking the British East India Company model of predatory capitalism and they're running it in reverse. Don't think that any of these projects are for your betterment. They're not. And this is not about the Chinese people. The Chinese people are under the worst suppression in the world of any nation on earth by this radical cadre, the CCP. And this is not about the containment of China. This is not about the Chinese people. This is about a business model of state capitalism financed by the West, technology provided by the West, that's for profit that's allowed this to happen. That is what Trump, and these are not a few simple things that can happen. This is not a trade war. This is an economic war. They've been running this economic war for 20 years. This deal is a truce. This deal is an armistice. It's not about are they going to buy more soybeans. We already know that's why all the liars on Wall Street that said the stock market was going to implode, the economy was going to implode, all the Democrats, everything's going to happen. Nothing happened on Wall Street. You know why? The Chinese have very few bullets in the chamber. They're looking down an economic shotgun from the United States. We cut them off on technology. We can put ZTE and Huawei out of business in 30 days. 30 days. They're looking down an economic shotgun because the Thucydides trap crowd in the West, in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in Washington, D.C., on Wall Street, they all said the West is in decline. And that is a fundamental lie. And the working class people in Ohio and Midlands, England, and now throughout Europe understand it's a lie, understand it's been a bill of goods sold to them. Okay. Unfortunately, the environment in Washington is too toxic to talk about working together with Russia over the long term. But I think that's going to happen as this toxicity starts to decline. Okay. And I think they're a natural ally of the Judeo-Christian West.
From the toxicity to the fragrant. Anna.
Thank you. I have a small remark. I just want to emphasize that we are here. Our panel's topic was crisis of trust. But unfortunately, we had to discuss the opportunities to regain the trust. But unfortunately, as we saw, we are 8 people on the stage, and we cannot find 2 of us trusting each other, and maybe on the audience as well. This is not a good sign for the future. This is just for thinking, further thinking. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much indeed. That's a nice way to wrap it up, but I bet all the panel talk to each other afterwards. The big problem, as I see it, is not about having different viewpoints. That's healthy. That's very good to have different viewpoints. The trouble is the amount of uncertainty and division in the world. There's so many us's and thems. You're a Brexit supporter or you're not. You're a Trump supporter or you're not. And in between, there's so much anger. There's anger everywhere about these issues. And if we can talk about them, in such a civilized way as we have mostly today, that's a very good news. And certainly in an uncertain world as we live in, the even better news is democracies very rarely go to war with each other. And I think Mr. Trump doesn't want to go to war because it would be bad for business. And he is, after all, a businessman more than a politician. But his determination to shake up the status quo could have global consequences. It's very clear the power balance is more opaque than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to you, and thank you to this wonderful panel.
And thank you, Stephen. It's interesting and shows how the Eurasian Media Forum can speak very candidly and openly on panels like this. There was a story from the Cold War era where an American told a Russian, "I can stand in front of the White House and shout, 'Go to hell, President Reagan.'" And the Russian said, "Well, that's nothing. I can stand in front of the Kremlin and say, 'Go to hell, President Reagan,' too." Ladies and gentlemen, only 15 minutes for a quick coffee break, and then please come back and we'll start the next session. Thank you again to the panel and to Stephen Cole.
Thank you.